With noise emanating from Liverpool around Alexander Isak, we're going to be discussing that as well as Chelsea's continuous links with Newcastle United's targets in this episode of NUFC Transfer Daily. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much to everybody who's continuously supported me, liked, shared and subscribed. If you haven't already, please do so. Hit like on this video because it really does help. Up to 1,300 subscribers now, aiming to get to 1,500 as quickly as possible. So please do get involved if you haven't already. Full disclosure, today I had a completely different thumbnail designed last night. We were going to talk about very similar things but in a different order to what I had planned to do until about 20 minutes ago. I'm recording this around sort of 9:30, 9:45. And the rumours around Alexander Isak and the intensity of this Liverpool interest that sort of come through this morning and last night has made me sort of change tack, because I want to discuss and maybe allay a few fears and look at this as objectively as I can from a Newcastle perspective, because all the reports are very much from a Liverpool perspective. Give some context and hopefully balance the discussion a little bit, because, as I say, lots of conversations around Liverpool and a little bit of misreporting of the current situation in my view, and I think that it's been not fully understood where Newcastle's position on Alexander Isak actually is. So the story is basically that Liverpool are going to be looking at a possibility of signing Alexander Isak again once they've signed Florian Wirtz for 116 million, which would then, and Milos Kerkez for about 40 million, joining Jeremy Frimpong for 29 million. And the noise is that Liverpool can do a deal for Alexander Isak if they sell a few players, and that shouldn't be a problem for them because of Darwin Núñez possibly leaving and for around 50 to 70 million. That's apparently what they want for him. There's other players as well, Federico Chiesa, Luis Diaz, and then they will funnel all that cash for one last go for Alexander Isak before moving on to other targets, which is nothing to be concerned about if you're Newcastle, in my opinion, because Newcastle have made their position eminently clear. Liverpool and Arsenal have both been in contact with Newcastle and been in contact with Alexander Isak's people to see what the situation with a possible deal is, and neither of them have made a move. Arsenal have moved on completely. They've gone for Benjamin Šeško and Victor Gyökeres by the sounds of it. Liverpool have Hugo Ekitike as their alternative, as well as Manchester United, and Chelsea is also on their list as well. But they want Alexander Isak and they want to give it one more chance. They think that they can still get this deal done, because the belief is that Newcastle want £150 million for Alexander Isak, and that isn't strictly true. That is the minimum value that Newcastle would need to consider a deal. That doesn't mean that he's got £150 million as a price tag on his head. It means that basically that is the least that you could discuss a deal with from Newcastle's perspective. Some reports last night that Liverpool are going to offer a guaranteed £100 million for Isak with add-ons on top. That won't fly from the perspective of where Newcastle are right now. Ultimately, none of this matters until Alexander Isak makes his move, and I think you've got to think back to Bruno Guimaraes last summer, and that's a very sort of similar thing as to how I see this playing out, because Manchester City were extremely interested in Bruno Guimaraes by all accounts. He had this release clause in his contract that they didn't want to pay. They wanted to look for a cheaper deal, but they needed Bruno to make his move if they were going to come to the table. I think this is very similar for Isak, and I don't think Isak's going to do that to the level that Liverpool need him to for this deal to happen. That's just my view on it. I think Isak is very happy at the club. I think he may well be interested in a move to Liverpool if it was offered to him as a straight choice. If the same with Bruno last summer, if Manchester City had got a deal in place, I think he would have had a decision to make. That isn't the same thing as saying he will push for the move. He's very settled at Newcastle. Talks for a new contract are planned. He's in the Champions League. He's very well paid. He will be paid even more in the next contract that he signs. As I said last week, I do think that Newcastle need to protect themselves here, maybe put a release clause in place. This isn't a contract strictly just to keep Isak for long term, because that's potentially unrealistic. It is difficult to see Isak sign a new contract if there isn't a possibility that he has a route out if the Newcastle don't get into the Champions League again in the future. But the point is that both parties are keen to talk about new contracts next next month, which doesn't suggest to me that Isak is ready to push for this move to Liverpool. I think, as I say, it's a very different thing between saying yes to the opportunity when the deal is on the table and pushing for it to happen. Liverpool aren't talking about paying 150 million anyway. They're trying to do a deal there where Arsenal were. They believe that there may be an opportunity. This isn't a thing of that they've got any encouragement. They think they're just going to chance their arm before eventually moving on to Hugo Ekitike. So if Newcastle hold firmly Isak, I think that they'll be able to keep him. They're in a very strong position, 3 years in his contract, Champions League football. He's very well paid. There's the ability to pay him more, as I've said. If they let him go, then the whole summer and the whole next season spirals into crisis because other players in the squad are looking at that thinking that's not very ambitious. You then have to go and find a replacement for him. And yeah, I just think there's a misrepresentation from the Liverpool side of these reports of the situation. The other thing is that the Joao Pedro interest that Newcastle have amongst fans and reporters is being used as a way to maybe test the water for Isak. But we all know that Joao Pedro would come in as competition for Isak or a stand-in for Isak, not as a replacement for Isak. That's just not the way that Newcastle are acting. There's no thought process of how to adapt to Alexander Isak leaving this summer. Framing of this doesn't represent the reality. I think Newcastle will sit down with Isak to talk about a new contract. Maybe Liverpool's long-term chances grow if he doesn't sign a new contract this summer. But this is not the time for Liverpool to be talking about signing Alexander Isak, at least at this stage. As I say, it depends what Isak does. Obviously, if Isak pushes for the move, then the dynamics change. Then perhaps Newcastle need to react. But that's exactly what Manchester City said to Bruno Guimaraes, and that didn't happen. I don't think that Isak is going to do that either. I hope that clears things up. I hope that offers the other side of this thing, because the lots of the discussions around Isak in the last sort of 24 hours has been very much about Liverpool's perspective and them seeing what they can do. And from Newcastle's perspective, nothing has changed. So it's going to be very, very difficult for Liverpool to get anywhere with this. But you have to strap yourselves in, because this is going to be a long summer, because Alexander Isak is the dream target for many, many clubs in England and in Europe. But we'll move on to what I was originally going to headline this with, and that's Chelsea, who have been very, very strongly linked with a number of Newcastle targets, Joao Pedro being the optimum one. Fabrizio Romano and The Guardian both mentioning in the last day or two that Chelsea have contacted Brighton about Pedro and seen how that deal can be played out. There's obviously reports that emerged last week that we mentioned that Joao Pedro wants to live in London, so that's potentially problematic for Newcastle. All that's the case, but Newcastle is still quite far ahead, I think, that in terms of this deal. I think Newcastle have actually had more formal talks with Brighton and had more informal talks with Joao Pedro's people. Chelsea at the point where Newcastle were a couple of weeks ago, where they've inquired about the price of a deal, I think, and also they've just really mentioned him as a possible target. The situation with Chelsea now is that they want a versatile forward who can challenge Nicholas Jackson and Liam Delap up front, but also play out wide. They need a new wide player. Jamie Gittins is their main target, according to The Guardian, but Mohamed Kudus and Xavi Simons, who we'll talk about again in a minute, both on Newcastle's radar, are also on Chelsea's radar as well. So there's a lot of players that Newcastle and Chelsea are going for, and that's kind of indicative of the current transfer landscape, that with these clubs, only a few players will improve the first teams of these clubs, and they're more often than not the same pool of players. So Newcastle have got to be ready for this fight if they really want Joao Pedro. I think that they're ahead of Chelsea in the Joao Pedro deal. I think Jamie Gittins is the man they bid for, they really want, but they need a new wide player because Raheem Sterling's not part of the picture. Jadon Sancho's gone back. Mykhailo Mudryk has now been given a doping charge as well. So Chelsea do need forward reinforcements, and Joao Pedro is one player on the list. Newcastle have him as a higher target, I think. I do know it doesn't help the nerves when the summer's going as frustratingly as it has for Newcastle, but keep calm a little bit, because I think, as I say, Chelsea's name is in there, but they haven't made moves yet. They haven't established him as a top target. Jamie Gittins is the man that they want. I think that they'll try and get that deal tied up after the Club World Cup. The other thing to mention quickly is Xavi Simons. We talked about him earlier this week. Again, on Chelsea's radar, according to The Guardian, they've spoken about him and Ekitike as well. So there's plenty of players on Chelsea's radar. But Newcastle linked in Bild as one of 4 Premier League clubs interested in the Dutchman. I won't go into too much detail about how he would fit. I think he'd be an ideal signing. I think Newcastle need to look at deals that would raise the ceiling rather than raising the floor. The type of Tonali-esque deal that they did 2 years ago that transforms the squad on paper. Xavi Simons is one of those players, and for the price that he's available at, similar to Joao Pedro, and Anthony Elanga, it makes a lot of sense for this deal to happen. I don't know whether the German report is particularly reliable. I don't know how high Xavi Simons is on Newcastle's list, but he would make a lot of sense for me. And he would be available at a price that's worth it. He would be the sort of player that would fit into the top end of Newcastle's wage structure, and also crucially would not interfere with Newcastle's ability to give Alexander Isak a huge pay rise as well. So that's what I think about Xavi Simons, and I understand it's worrying that Chelsea are in for a number of Newcastle's targets, but that is just the reality. When you go for these top players, other top clubs are going to be there, and you do have to sell that project. In the case of Joao Pedro, though, Newcastle, I think, are further ahead. Chelsea have looked at him, have inquired, they haven't made a move, and Jamie Gittins is very much the man on their radar. Just another quick thing from Mark Douglas in the Eye today, that Newcastle's stadium plans that were supposed to be announced this month are going to be delayed. I think this is indicative of the issues that are creating the panic in the transfer situation, because it feels chaotic off the pitch. It feels a bit scattergun, like there's no direction. Andy Howe and Steve Nixon are doing the deals on the recruitment side, but there's no news on the CEO. None of those things can really sort of be calmed down until those things are dealt with. So this is another negative thing, I think, in terms of Newcastle. Need to sort this out off the pitch before fans feel that they can trust that the process is going to go well. I did tweet yesterday, and I think this is very, very fair, even though I understand the context is different. Newcastle have signed previously Nick Pope and Sven Botman and Sandro Tonali early in windows. They were seen as early in the windows in 2022 and 2023. None of them had happened by this point. I think Nick Pope was 23rd of June, Sven Botman was the 1st of July, and Sandro Tonali was the 3rd of July. Crucially, that 1st of July is when the accounts years change for the PSR situation. Newcastle can spend before that, but they can obviously spend more after. Nothing's moved on by the time Newcastle are coming back for pre-season. Potentially that's the moment that you panic. But the fact that there's so little direction off the pitch in the boardroom at the moment is kind of where I think fans are getting a little bit concerned. Thanks so much for joining me on this video. Like, share and subscribe. Let me know in the comment section below what you think on Alexander Isak's situation, Joao Pedro's situation, Xavi Simons' situation, and also I'm going to be looking at possibly doing a bonus Q&A on Sunday. I've got a bit of time, so I may well do a Q&A on Sunday. So if you have any questions, do drop them in the comments, and also I'll tweet this out and put it on Blue Sky and get your questions in for that video, and if there's enough I will sit down and answer them. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.